Savannah, 1866. The war was over, but not the chains. Cypress Bend still rose from the riverbank like a ghost that refused to rot. Its white-pillared house gleaming against the marsh, its fields stretching out in silence, where once there had been the thunder of overseers' whips and the groans of the enslaved. The papers in Washington spoke of emancipation, yet in Savannah the word lived only in ink. On the ground it meant hunger, it meant debt, it meant old masters inventing new ways to keep the same yoke pressed on the same bent backs. Elizabeth was 30 years old, a woman of sharp cheekbones and weary eyes, a cook whose life had been boiled down to smoke, grease, and the sting of fire on skin. She had grown in the shadow of Cypress Bend, born to a field hand who never saw another winter after her birth. Too frail for the fields, Elizabeth had been placed in the kitchen by the age of 10. There, her body was claimed not by the plough, but by the scalding iron pots, the knives that slipped too easily, the endless hours of turning grain and stirring stew for others to eat while she licked broth from her cracked fingers in secret. Now, in 1866, she bore scars both visible and hidden. A burn that ran like a pale river across her forearm, a missing tooth from a blow she had not seen coming. But deeper than all these was the slow poison of humiliation. And on a sweltering afternoon that year, Master Henry Clark poured that poison into her for the last time. The day had begun with the usual haste, chickens plucked, bread kneaded in sweat, pots groaning with syrup. Elizabeth worked without pause, her son Jamie trailing her in the kitchen house, 9 years old and watchful, already tall for his age. He whispered questions about letters, about books, about how to make words line into meaning. She hushed him, promising he would learn soon, that the parish teacher might take him if only she kept her place steady. She stirred the syrup with her broad paddle, sweat stinging her eyes, praying the sugar would not scorch. But Henry Clark had woken restless, his temper whetted not by hunger but by vanity. A pair of silver cufflinks had gone missing. He did not care that he himself had misplaced them the week before. He needed a spectacle, a theatre of dominance, something to remind his guests and his wife that the old ways had not vanished with Appomattox. "Fetch Elizabeth," he said to the overseer. "Let her stand as an example." By midday the porch was crowded, gentlemen from the neighbouring estates, ladies with parasols, children eager for sport. Cypress Bend was to be the stage, and Elizabeth, unwilling, would be the performance. She was dragged from the kitchen, her apron still damp with broth, her hands raw from scrubbing kettles. A plank sign was hung across her chest. It bore one word scorched into the wood: thief. The crowd shifted, murmuring, some amused, some uneasy, but none spoke against it. Henry Clark stepped forward, his hair oiled, his face red from drink. He circled her as though she were livestock for sale. "This here," he declared, voice booming, "thought to cheat me. But I teach my servants lessons they will not forget." From his pocket he produced a razor, and with deliberate cruelty he began shaving uneven patches of her hair. Tufts fell to the porch boards, sticking to the sweat of her neck. Each slice was punctuated by laughter. Children pointed. Ladies covered their mouths, but did not turn away. Then came the slop. Buckets of swill, pig refuse, and spoiled broth were poured over her head until it clung to her dress, dripping foul down her arms and legs. The smell clung to her nostrils, sour and unshakable. A guest chuckled, "Better seasoning than she's ever managed in the kitchen." Elizabeth did not speak. She did not lift her eyes. But she felt the heat rise in her chest, a slow and smouldering fire that would not be extinguished. Finally, Henry commanded her to crawl. On hands and knees, slick with slop, her scalp patchy and raw, she was ordered to return to the kitchen house before them all. Gravel tore into her palms and knees. The porch boards scraped her skin. Guests leaned forward as though watching a spectacle at the theatre. Henry's voice chased her down the steps. "Remember, this is mercy. Another master would have used the whip." She crawled across the yard, her body bent like an animal, the sun pressing fire into her back. Jamie stood frozen by the kitchen door, his small fists clenched, his face pale with rage he could not voice. When she reached him, she whispered only, "Inside, child, inside." Behind her, the laughter of the porch rolled like thunder, but within her, something older stirred, a seed planted long ago, watered by grief and betrayal, waiting for the day it would bloom in silence and in fire. For Elizabeth, that day had not yet come. But after the porch, after the sign, after the slop and the crawl, she would never again mistake humiliation for survival. The kitchen house at Cypress Bend was both sanctuary and prison. Its brick walls trapped the heat of the hearth, its floor slick with grease and spilled broth, its air heavy with smoke and steam. Elizabeth had spent 2 decades in that space, learning every creak of its beams, every draft through its warped shutters. Here she reigned over iron pots, dough troughs, and knives dulled from endless chopping. But here, too, she lived under the eye of Mary Clark. If Henry's cruelty was spectacle, Mary's was ritual. She required no audience. Her theatre was the kitchen, her applause the silence of those who feared her. Mistress Clark had always prided herself on refinement. Porcelain dishes from England, lace collars from New Orleans, recipes clipped from newspapers in Charleston. Yet she measured refinement not by taste or beauty, but by the sharpness with which she could humiliate those beneath her. Elizabeth bore the brunt of it. Mary accused her daily of spoiling food. Too much salt, she would sneer, or not enough butter, though she had ordered both. She carried a heavy silver spoon in her apron pocket, and when displeased, she would strike Elizabeth's knuckles with it, sharp enough to swell the joints, but never enough to break bone. Bruises faded, but the ache lingered, turning each movement of the hand into pain. Meals for the Clark family were warm, rich, steaming. For Elizabeth, only scraps cooled to hardness were allowed. Mary forbade her from eating anything fresh from the stove. A cook who eats warm meals grows lazy, she declared. So Elizabeth swallowed cold corn pone while the scent of roasting meat tormented her nose. The floor of the kitchen was forever wet, whether from spilled water or Mary's own deliberate buckets poured at the threshold. Cleanliness, she called it, though she placed the pail so that Elizabeth, entering with a heavy tray, would slip before the eyes of visitors. More than once, Elizabeth fell, food scattering, laughter rising from the parlor, as if the fall itself were part of the entertainment. Mary never shouted. Her cruelty was quiet, sharpened by the calm smile of a lady certain of her superiority, yet in its quietness it cut deeper than Henry's drunken spectacles. She struck knuckles, denied meals, forced Elizabeth barefoot onto wet stone floors until her soles blistered, and she always ended with the same phrase, "This is for your improvement. You should thank me." Through it all, Jamie watched. 9 years old, lanky and restless, he haunted the edges of the kitchen. He fetched wood, washed spoons, carried scraps to the slop bucket. His eyes were bright, always darting to the pages of old newspapers used to line the pantry shelves. He traced the letters with his finger, whispering sounds he did not yet understand. At night he asked Elizabeth what they meant. She could not answer. Henry Clark noticed the boy's hunger for words, and one evening, over supper, he made a promise. "If your mother serves flawlessly until autumn," he said, slapping grease from his fingers, "then Jamie may learn from the parish teacher. A few letters, perhaps numbers. That is, if she proves herself worth it." The words burned into Elizabeth like a brand. She carried them in her chest, heavy as stone. For weeks she labored without fault, tasting and retasting every dish, polishing every cup until it gleamed, enduring every blow of Mary's spoon without a sound. At night she whispered to Jamie, "Hold on. Soon you will learn your letters. Soon you will open books wider than the river itself." Jamie's hope became her anchor. She endured because of him. Each strike of the spoon, each stumble on wet stone, each cold scrap she swallowed in silence, she endured them for the thought of her son bent over a school desk, pencil scratching, eyes alight with knowledge denied her. But hope in Cypress Bend was only another instrument of cruelty. The summer thickened, the air pressing heavy as syrup. Elizabeth's hands grew raw from scrubbing, her feet blistered from standing barefoot on wet brick. Still she worked without error. Still she held the promise of autumn close, a fragile flame she refused to let gutter out. Mary watched her closely. "You think you are clever," she said once, lips curling, "but cleverness in your kind is dangerous. Better to keep your head down and your tongue still. Remember that." Elizabeth did remember. She remembered every bruise, every fall, every morsel denied. But more than that, she remembered Jamie's face, the way his eyes widened at the sight of letters on a page. That memory was stronger than Mary's cruelty, stronger than Henry's humiliation. It was the only thing that kept her from breaking. Yet the cruelty did not stop. It sharpened. Mary placed a bucket by the doorway at every opportunity, waiting for Elizabeth's stumble. She struck the spoon harder across swollen knuckles. She forbade her even the cold scraps some nights, claiming wastefulness, forcing her to go hungry after feeding others. And still Elizabeth worked, still she prayed the autumn would come, and with it, the teacher's gift for her son. Hope was the chain, and soon it would be pulled tight enough to choke. Late that summer, when the air pressed heavy and the mosquitoes rose in clouds from the marsh, the lie revealed itself. A missing key, small, brass, hardly worth notice, vanished from Mary Clark's dressing table. She searched her jewelry box, rattled the drawers, and declared the household in disarray. Her voice, calm but cold, carried through the halls like a blade sliding from its sheath. "Someone has taken it," she announced, though her eyes fixed already on Jamie. The boy stood by the smokehouse, hands black with soot from carrying wood for the ovens. He looked up, startled as Mary approached. "You," she said, pointing her pale finger, "were closest. Confess." Jamie shook his head. His eyes, wide and frightened, darted to Elizabeth, who had just stepped from the kitchen house, her apron still stained with flour. "I didn't, mistress. I never touched it," he whispered. His voice cracked, but it carried truth. Elizabeth heard it, felt it, but Henry Clark, summoned by his wife's cry, was already flushed with drink and impatience. He believed accusation more than innocence. "Boy thinks he's clever," Henry muttered. "Stealing keys now, soon it'll be books." He seized Jamie by the arm, his grip cruel enough to bruise. "We'll make sure he learns honesty another way." They dragged him to the smoke pit behind the sugar house, where fires burned low to cure meat and render syrup. The pit was lined with hot stones, its air suffused with the stench of ash and fat. Elizabeth followed, her body trembling, but the overseer barred her with his whip held sideways across her chest. Henry forced Jamie to kneel beside the pit, so close that the rising heat licked his skin. Mary stood by, lips pressed thin, eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "Discipline," she murmured. "He must be broken of deceit." The boy whimpered, his small body shaking. The heat seared his arms, his face, his bare legs. The overseer pressed his hand to the edge of the stones until he cried out, the smell of singed flesh thick in the air. Elizabeth's throat closed with horror. She clawed at the overseer's arm, begging, but was thrown to the dirt. "Enough," Mary said at last, her voice sharp with mock compassion. "Let him stew in his lesson." They dragged him away, skin blistered, breath shallow, and threw him onto a pallet in the corner of the quarters. Elizabeth ran to him, cradling his body. His eyes were glassy, his breath ragged, his skin hot as the stones themselves. She bathed his burns with cool water, sang low to him, pressed her cheek to his hair. "Hold on, Jamie," she whispered, "just hold on." But through the night his breathing grew slower, weaker. His small hand clutched hers once, then slackened. When dawn came, Jamie's chest no longer rose. The promise of autumn, the promise of letters, the promise of schooling, all lies. Henry had never spoken truth. The boy's death was the cost of hope. Elizabeth washed his small shirt in a barrel that morning, scrubbing the blood and ash from the cotton until her hands bled. Others passed by and laughed, saying, "Best hold your tongue. Best not lose your place too." Their voices rang crueler than the whip. No one would mourn with her, no one would speak his name. She hung the shirt to dry, the fabric limp and pale against the hot sky. It swayed in the wind like a ghost. Elizabeth stood beneath it, her eyes fixed, her body hollow. She felt the emptiness of the quarters pressing on her, the silence of those who would not risk pity. In the kitchen, the fire burned as always. Porridge bubbled, meat roasted. Syrup boiled in the iron vat, thick and sweet, the air sharp with sugar. Elizabeth stood before it, her body heavy with grief, her soul emptied. She took the wooden stirring paddle in her hand, feeling its weight. The handle was smooth from years of work, its grain warm against her palm. She lifted it slowly, testing its heft, imagining it not as a tool of labor, but as a weapon of decision. The kitchen was silent except for the bubbling syrup, the hiss of steam, the crackle of the fire. Elizabeth breathed deep, the smoke filling her lungs. Her grief hardened into resolve. The paddle trembled in her grip only once, before her fingers tightened. The promise had been a lie. The boy was gone. The world had no mercy left to give her. In that silence, she made her decision. Night fell heavy over Cypress Bend, pressing its damp weight onto the fields and the river. The air smelled of cane, wet soil, and the faint sweetness of syrup boiling late in the sugar house. Crickets droned in the distance. The estate seemed quiet, but inside Elizabeth's chest, thunder rolled. All day she had worked in silence, her grief hidden behind bowed shoulders and steady hands. No one spoke Jamie's name, his shirt dried stiff on the line, fluttering like a pale flag of surrender. Yet inside Elizabeth, no surrender remained. She moved through the kitchen with the precision of a shadow, gathering her strength, her silence becoming steel. By evening, the clerks grew curious about the fresh syrup boiling in the great iron vat. It was custom to taste the season's first batch, to sample the sweetness that enslaved hands had coaxed from cane and fire. Henry announced he would inspect the sugar house after supper, Mary at his side. Their guests, restless from wine, followed eagerly. A tasting at the vat was as much amusement as tradition. Elizabeth lit lanterns along the sugar house walls, their flames flickering against beams blackened by years of smoke. The vat hissed, its surface bubbling like molten gold. She stirred with the heavy paddle, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. When Henry and Mary entered, laughter spilling behind them, she set the paddle down. The overseer lingered at the doorway, but did not step inside. The clerks commanded the room, stepping close to the steaming vat, inhaling the sweet air. Henry dipped a spoon, smacking his lips. "Perfect," he declared, "worth the season." Mary, smiling faintly, leaned close to taste for herself. Elizabeth moved quickly, silently. She grasped the heavy latch and slammed it down across the door. The overseer shouted, rattling the handle, but the iron bar held. The clerks turned, startled, confusion spreading across their faces. "What is this?" Henry barked. Elizabeth did not answer. She lifted the great paddle, her arms steady, her back straight, her eyes fixed on them with a calm they had never seen. For years she had bent, crawled, endured. Now she stood taller than the rafters. With one heave, she tipped the vat. The boiling syrup cascaded in a scalding wave, spilling across the floor, splashing onto clothes, skin, and the polished boots of the clerks. Their laughter snapped into screams, high and raw, echoing against the wooden walls. They stumbled, slipping on the sticky flood, their hands clawing at the door that would not open. The overseer outside cursed and pounded, but the latch held fast. Elizabeth advanced, the paddle in her grip, no longer a tool, but a weapon. Henry clawed at her, his face contorted in rage and fear, but she swung with the strength of grief sharpened into justice. The wood cracked against his skull, sending him sprawling into the syrup. Mary shrieked, her hands burning as she tried to push herself upright. Elizabeth struck again, the paddle falling with the finality of a gavel. They writhed, they pleaded, but she did not flinch. Each blow was a memory. The porch, the sign, the spoon, the slop, the crawl, the lie, the promise, the boy's blistered body. With every strike, she erased humiliation with fire and wood. The screams dwindled into silence. The syrup hissed as it cooled, thick and red gold across the floorboards. Henry and Mary lay crumpled, their fine clothes soaked, their bodies stilled. The lanterns flickered above, casting shadows that made the walls seem to lean in, as if bearing witness. Outside, the overseer had fled for help. The night stretched long. Elizabeth did not run. She did not weep. She sat by the hearth of the sugar house, cleaning the ladle with calm precision, as though preparing for another meal. The paddle rested beside her, streaked and darkened. At dawn, the overseer returned with neighbors and constables. They found the door barred, the air heavy with the scent of scorched sugar and death. Henry and Mary Clark lay sprawled on the sticky boards, their faces locked in terror. Elizabeth sat by the hearth, her hands folded, the ladle gleaming in her lap. She lifted her eyes as the men entered. Her voice was quiet, steady, carrying no tremor. "I did it," she said. The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke. The men shifted uneasily. Newspapers would soon call it savagery. Neighbors would demand swift punishment. But in that moment, in that room, Elizabeth was more than a cook, more than a servant, more than a woman brought to crawl. She was reckoning made flesh. They brought Elizabeth in, wearing a plain dress, scrubbed so hard it showed white at the seams. Her hair, still ragged where Henry had shorn it, made a crown of absence around her face. Shackles touched stone with a small, cold sound. Outside, neighbors muttered savagery, and men with clean collars spoke of order, as if what had ruled Cypress Bend had ever been anything but a ritual of humiliation. The trial took 2 days because ceremony demanded it, not because truth was in doubt. There was no counsel, only a clerk to note her name, and a prosecutor who painted the sugar house with words: the barred door, the tipped vat, the paddle descending like a judge's hand. The overseer testified that she confessed without tears. A neighbor's wife said she could still smell the syrup in her dreams. The jury stared as though looking at a stove given a voice. When asked if she wished to speak, Elizabeth lifted her head slowly, as if listening to a distant tide. "You promised a boy letters," she said. "You gave him Burns." No one wrote that down. The judge cleared his throat and called her words irrelevant to the charge. The room nodded, grateful to be steered back to custom. Verdict: guilty. Sentence: death to be carried out at once, for fear that kitchens might begin to boil with wickedness. Outside, the river moved on, indifferent. Inside, Mary's friends dabbed their eyes. Henry's companions whispered that softness had invited chaos. Not a soul spoke Jamie's name. At dawn, they marched her to the yard behind the jail, where gallows timbers still smelled of fresh-cut pine. The rope swung lightly, like a lazy clock. A preacher offered a prayer about obedience. Elizabeth looked past him toward the east, where the cane fields gathered mist. She did not weep, she did not beg. She simply rested her palm a moment on the place her apron used to tie and whispered something only the fire would understand. When the trap fell, the crowd flinched as one body. For a heartbeat, the morning went soundless. No gull, no wheel, no boot. Then the world resumed, as if nothing had been balanced. Newspapers called it a warning. They printed her as monster and the Clarks as martyrs of post-war disorder. Editors praised the swiftness, as though haste were proof of justice. But in the kitchens, the story turned its face. Washerwomen carried it in steam, apprentices caught it in flour dust, boys who hauled wood hid it under their tongues. They did not name the syrup or the blows. They spoke instead of a sign that said thief, a shaved scalp, a crawl through gravel, a boy who reached for letters and was given fire. In those whispers, Elizabeth did not hang. She stood at the sugar house door with her paddle like a mast. She stood in every pot where a cook stirred with a slower wrist, measuring not only salt but insult. She stood beside buckets, moved quietly away from thresholds meant to trip. She stood in soft refusals, a spoon set down, a gaze held one heartbeat too long, a recipe kept back. Children in the quarters learned a new proverb. Humiliation is a debt. One day it asks to be paid. And when an overseer bragged that Savannah is safe again, a midwife laughed under her breath and said, "From what exactly?" Years would unspool. The estate would pass to cousins who spoke of thrift. Cypress Bend's porch would bleach in sun and rain. But on winter nights, when syrup hissed and kettles sang, someone would always lower a voice and tell the tale of the woman who barred a door and turned sweetness into judgment. Not for spectacle, for measure. So the city kept 2 ledgers, the printed one, heavy with lies, and the spoken one, light enough to carry anywhere. In the printed book, Elizabeth was a caution. In the spoken, she was a line drawn at last, a hand closing around a handle, a mother refusing to let silence live where her son had died. And if you listen, even now, where the river licks the pilings and the wind touches cane, You can hear a paddle knock once against an iron rim, like a knuckle on a locked door, a name like a low bell, Elizabeth who would not crawl again.